It's recording. Boom chakalaka. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. In our next conversation with Jay Mackley, a limited geography Heartlander, we're going to talk about some of the big issues, DNA and geology. How does Jay explain those issues? We'll also talk about his version of tight translation of the Book of Mormon and why he thinks there's a temple in the land of Zarahemla right across the river from Nauvoo. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. I really want to talk a little bit about the DNA issue, and I know you're not a DNA expert, but
I think you asked John this too, and he said I'm not a DNA expert.
And you can say that, that's fine.
That's what I'm going to have to say.
But it just seems like it's really hard to tie either the Kennewick Man or the Hopewell to Middle Eastern DNA.
And I can't really have
That's not your specialty.
But here's what I will say. I believe that we have Middle Eastern influence, in America, but that's not all. I'm sure there were other people, and we were talking about the Phoenicians who came over here and traded. And so there's another influence, and there were probably influences that came up from Central and South America, maybe. And none of these are documented in the Book of Mormon, but, 5 times in the Book of Mormon it says, I'm only relating, by the way, I'm only relating 1/100th of the activities that took place. And so there's so much that took place in the Book of Mormon times that they don't share with us because the space was limited on the plates. And so.
Well, and I was just talking to Rod Meldrum a couple weeks ago, and I presented at the Firm Foundation, and I showed clips from Simon Southerton, Ugo Perego, and Thomas Murphy, because I know the Kennewick Man, there's a book, Face of a Nephite, but Ugo, who's a population geneticist, that's what he does, that's what his degree was in, one of the best world-renowned geneticists. I mentioned this to Terry Patience also. You accept Ugo's work. In Terry's case, Terry doesn't believe Joseph practiced polygamy, and he cites Ugo's DNA tests to say, look, clearly Joseph didn't have children from women other than Emma. But then when Ugo says, well, wait a minute, the Kennewick Man was here 10,000 years ago, and the Native Americans that are here probably crossed the Bering Strait 30,000 years ago, Heartlanders are going to say, well, we don't trust the science, we believe the Bible, this earth is only 6,000 years old, so we don't trust Ugo. A lot of people are going to have problems with that. Well, I trust him for this thing because I like the results, and I don't trust him for this thing because I don't like the results. It doesn't agree with me. It seems like Heartlanders especially cherry pick what they like and what they don't like. They look at forgeries. Well, the DNA doesn't match, but we're gonna make it match. What do you say about that?
We don't believe typically in the mainstream perspective. Obviously, I don't believe in 10,000 years or 30,000 years or 30 million years. When it comes to cherry picking, you don't know how scientists work, do you? They find something, and they send it off to the lab. And they find multiple things, and they get multiple responses back. They may make 10 or 12 responses back. And some of the responses say, this thing is 10 years old, and this is a negative 5 years old. And this one's 30,000 years old, and this one's 300 years old. And they go, that must be the one that's right. And they pick the 300 one. I mean, this has been documented.
I think that's mischaracterizing how they work.
You may think that, and that's probably true with some people, but I think that happens a lot. And then somebody publishes it, and then it becomes a fact. And nobody else actually looks into it. What is your sample? What are all your samples? What were all your dates? Did you cherry pick on these? They do it a lot. And they don't admit it, but a lot of cases have been documented that happens. And so do I just accept it at face value? Not at all. I want to see the full report. I don't want to hear hearsay from a mainstream archaeologist who heard it from Bob, his friend, at the university over there, who claims that was the only sample. I just don't believe it. So there we go. I mean, I have a right not to believe it. Just like they have a right not to believe me.
Right.
In fact, I think I'm just as justified, if not more so, than they would be. So that's my perspective. 10,000, 30,000, no. And so, so you have elephant bones, you have horse bones that have been found in North America, but it's always, interestingly, just beyond, what the Bible would say, or just beyond what would be in the Book of Mormon. And yet there's arguments about that too behind the scenes, but they don't publish those. They just come out with what they decide to publish officially, and we're supposed to just believe it, because they're mainstream and they're the experts. Well, they're not sometimes, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on that we don't see, and some of that stuff is scandalous, and some of it's been reported and exposed, but most of it's kept under the rug. They cherry pick and they don't tell the truth because they have an agenda. Manifest majesty agenda has to be upheld. Everybody knows that you can't cross certain lines, and you get a lot more critical acceptance if you have a date that goes beyond the Bible than if you have a date that supports the Bible, because basically a lot of mainstream scientists are atheistic and anti-religion, and they don't want to have any of their work supporting anything that supports the Bible, and they actually feel that way. And I'm talking generally speaking. There's always lots of exceptions. But even those who feel differently often feel pressure to bend what they say and bend their findings to be acceptable to their peers, because they don't get peer approval, they don't get funding, they don't get that grant, they don't get published. Their career is shot. And so to go against the mainstream is a very dangerous thing for scientists to do in the area of archaeology or history in general. And so because of that fact, because I know that exists, that bias and that prejudice exists, do I just accept, when I hear 30,000 years? I do not. And I won't, because it's not rational.
Very interesting.
Wait a minute, in my opinion.
Let me throw a different believer's perspective on this. I interviewed Jerry Grover recently. He's written a book called Geology of the Book of Mormon, and he's more of a meso guy, but he says he's gone to them. When there was the destructions when Christ was killed in the Americas, let's say, there were a lot of cities that were destroyed, sunk. And one of his points is, you need to have faults, earthquake faults in your model. And he says one of the things that very few people do is they look at the geology of the Book of Mormon. He looks at the mists of darkness. This is going to be an issue that Heartlanders disagree with, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Okay.
With the ash clouds of a volcano, that sure sounds like mists of darkness. The storms that can accompany a lot of ash, a lot of static electricity, lightning in there. He feels like that is a really good explanation for the destructions that happened.
Never mind that there's no volcanoes in Mesoamerica.
No, there are. I mean, he's documented that in his thing. So, but even if you want to leave the volcanoes out, if you've got another explanation out, the point is when you have earthquakes, you need to look at earthquake zones. Where are the faults? Where are the cracks in the earth? Are they? And I'm not a geology expert. Are they shift shear or are they? I don't know all the terms, but
what does he think about the New Madrid earthquakes? I mean, I don't know I'm not familiar with him.
So my point is, I think this is something that you should add to your internal maps. One of the things that Jerry's done is with some of the meso, they've talked about this certain city should be destroyed, and he's like, that's not an earthquake zone. So they've had to move that city to an earthquake zone so that it matches better. And so he's kind of helped
wait
them.
a minute. I don't believe that at all. You cannot tell where earthquakes are going to happen and where they're never going to happen. If you knew that, you'd build your house there and you'd be safe for all time. But in the Book of Mormon, these earthquakes weren't expected. They didn't have earthquakes on a regular basis. In the New Madrid area, it was thought to be no earthquakes were expected there. I mean, it wasn't considered an earthquake.
Well,
zone.
the New Madrid fault, if it's a fault line, you would expect that's where the Earth's going to move, right? Because that's what a fault is, a fault line.
The New Madrid fault?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with there even is a New Madrid fault.
You need to read Jerry's book.
Maybe I do. Because, this New Madrid earthquake happened basically on the alluvial plain of the Mississippi River. There's lots of sand. There's lots of dirt. This stuff moves around all the time. And it's very, very deep. And so would you expect that? I'll tell you the New Madrid earthquakes, I do know a little bit about them in the fact that they did produce a lot of, and there's eyewitnesses accounts, huge amounts of sand geysers that ended up producing hills.
Yeah.
And there were electrical disturbances and extreme darkness that went on for a long time. And so in that sense, it matches. I think based on the model that the one happened in the Book of Mormon would have been further north than the New Madrid, which is south. I don't think it has to happen there, but
yeah. Well, yeah.
It's hard to predict where earthquakes are really going to happen. A lot of scientists don't find these faults until after the fact. So,
well, we know about San Andreas, we know about New Madrid, we know about
right, because earthquakes have happened there already.
Yeah.
But there could be an earthquake tomorrow in Upper Michigan, and we didn't expect that, but it could happen.
Well, with fracking, I guess we've got some new earthquakes, but
anyway.
Yeah, I would just say this.
We're getting out of my expertise.
So what I'm going to say, you need to read Geology of the Book of Mormon. Jerry has looked at that previously. He doesn't think the New Madrid fault matches the Book of Mormon. It doesn't match the destructions that occurred there. Don't match the cities that were destroyed.
How does he know what cities were destroyed there?
Well, he reads the Book of Mormon just like you.
Oh, but he's not talking about any specific thing that he's found. He's just talking about in general.
Yeah, he goes into a lot of volcano science and that sort of a thing, because typically a lot of times volcanoes and earthquakes come together. And so like you said, you can't predict. It's hard to predict. I know scientists are actually working on predicting earthquakes better. But if there was destruction 2,000 years ago, well, you would think there would be a fault line there, and that would probably explain after the fact. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, and I'm going to make up a city of Gideon was destroyed in an earthquake. I don't know if that's true. Is that true?
No.
Okay, whatever the city was.
Okay.
Give me an earthquake city.
Well, Zarahemla was destroyed by fire.
Okay.
During the earthquake. And we have cities like Josh, I think, was one of them.
Okay. So let's say the city of Josh. So if the city with Josh was destroyed, you would think it would probably be along an earthquake zone, a fault line. And so I'm just saying, you talked about your internal references. One of the most understudied areas is geology. I think Jerry's the only one who's done it. And so I would encourage you to put that in your
Frankly,
model.
I cannot see any study of earthquakes affecting my model whatsoever. I can't say that, hey, I can't put this city here because there's no earthquake.
Well, one of the things that Jerry said was...
saying? that doesn't make sense.
Because there's a Yucatan model, and he says that's the most seismically stable area in all of Central America. It couldn't have happened there.
Well, that's what I was saying. I didn't think they even had volcanoes down there. But
well, in the Yucatan, but closer to Guatemala, yeah, they've got some.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So he thinks
the Yucatan being that peninsula.
Yeah, that peninsula that goes north. Yeah.
Well, that's where they find all the cities, basically.
Yucatan. And I believe Joseph Smith said there was a finding in the Yucatan. He said that's a Lamanite city. But
no, he did not say that. In fact, Jonathan Never wrote a whole book on that. That came from a guy named Benjamin Winchester, and they tried to say that Joseph Smith said that because he was supposedly an active editor of the Times and Seasons at the time that article was put out. but he was not an active editor. He was on the run from the enemies.
So it was W.W. Phelps.
Yeah, well, the point is there was no credible evidence that Joseph Smith ever approved or wrote such a thing. And in fact, the only evidence out there, according to Jonathan Edwards, which I believe what he wrote in his book, is that Joseph Smith discouraged that and actually changed it when it came up in front of him. That I mean, it's so enticing to. I mean, I can see how missionaries do this. You know, they go into a home, they teach in the Book of Mormon, they say these great civilization lived, and here's the proof. And they whip out this stone temple from Guatemala that.
We don't do that anymore.
Well, I hope not, because these temples.
We didn't even do that on my mission. That was a long time ago.
But I mean, it carries forward. It carries forward. And that's where a lot of this stuff has started, because it's trying to impress investigators with how wonderful and how we found these amazing civilizations of North America. It's so much more exciting than saying we found a mound of dirt over there, But these sites in Central America and South America, for the most part too, are pagan temples where they sliced people open and took their hearts out, and they don't match anything like a real Israelite related temple would look. And so it's almost like blasphemy. I call it, Mesoidolatry, in my mind, because not only are the timelines wrong in Mesoamerica, but the actual temples and the design of them and what they were known to be used for contradicts everything that went on in the Book of Mormon. It's just unbelievable.
Well, let me ask you this, because you took me by site today right across the Mississippi River. Nauvoo's right across the Mississippi River.
Right.
I know Wayne May apparently has purchased this land, and he says that it was a temple of Zarahemla there.
He believes that.
He believes that. And so I think you guys are planning, correct me if I'm wrong, or Wayne, maybe I shouldn't say you guys, Wayne is planning on doing some ground-penetrating radar or something to see if we can find this. Is that right?
There's been some electrical resistivity scans that have been done, and they are somewhat positive toward the idea that there was a foundation there. And I don't know about the ground-penetrating radar or what Wayne's doing currently. I haven't.
Okay, maybe I moved that up, but that was my understanding.
Yeah.
So would you expect to find a temple in that lot there where Wayne thinks there's one?
I wouldn't expect to find any remnants of a temple, because
you wouldn't expect to.
I would expect it would have been made of wood, and that it would have been long ago dissolved into the dirt. So.
Okay.
But this sand foundation I'm talking about is the only thing that would indicate there was something special there that's been found. So. And you can build buildings on sand if it's the right kind of sand that interlocks. It's actually a good foundation because it drains water and keeps things away.
So what do you think Wayne, or do you think Wayne's going to find anything?
I don't think he's going to find anything more that's been found. Because right now there's been electrical or magnetometry scans done on that lot, and electrical resistivity scans which scan down. And so we have an idea what's underneath the dirt. And there's been some actual digging. That's before my time, before I got involved with the Heartland group, Heartland activities. But I don't see that there's anything left to be found. And it's basically not conclusive as far as proof at this point.
Is there anything that you guys can imagine finding that would prove to skeptics that Heartland is correct?
Well, let me approach that from two perspectives. One is the area of Montrose has been known for years as a rich artifact finding place. People have extensive collections in their barns, farmers around here, stuff they've plowed up. It was obviously a heavily populated area in antiquity because, they've found pearls and jewelry and pipes and pottery and some metal.
But that wouldn't prove a Nephite was here or a Lamanite.
No, it wouldn't prove that. But it just proves that it was, a heavily populated area at one time in antiquity. And so these artifacts have been found. There hasn't been anything that I know of that's been found that had any writing on it in this area. The biggest thing that we found so far in our research is, for that particular area, is the LiDAR scanning that's been done. We found the berms that I talked about, the earthworks, 10 miles worth of earthworks.
And that's here in Fort Madison?
No, that's actually down just south of Montrose.
Oh, Montrose.
Yeah.
And
so,
I guess, you know, I'm trying to put my skeptical hat on for a minute here.
No, that's your job. That's good.
So there's a berm, let's say it was built by humans.
Yeah.
It could have been any number of Indians or Native Americans that did this. What is the proof? How do we know that King Benjamin built it or whoever? I don't know. It might not date King Benjamin's time. But a Book of Mormon person, how would we know that those berms date to a Book of Mormon person that we could identify?
Well, because we were digging into the berm, we found a Zarahemla was here sign.
Oh, nice.
Actually, no.
See, that would be perfect. That would be great.
That would be great. But we just know, based on our research so far, that we believe that it's prior to 1878, based on the tree ring samples that we've taken.
Prior to 1878 is not Book of Mormon time.
This berm is massive, and it would require a Cahokia-type effort. And why would they do it, other than for defensive fortifications? And if it was a defensive fortification, then maybe it belonged to, you know, Native Americans of 800 AD, or maybe it was 100 AD. We don't know. So, but we expected to find something, and we did. That's the bottom line. We were so thrilled to get the LiDAR data, and when I found
But if it dated to 800 AD, that wouldn't help you, would it?
No. And so we need to do some additional work. So it's not conclusive at this point, but we're not done either. So we need to have an archaeological expedition that actually goes into these berms. We've done a little bit of preliminary look at them, but we need to actually get down and get a sifter and see what we can find. Because if it's a defensive wall berm, that means there were soldiers, you know, at least lookouts there. They probably had a human habitation and probably had a family nearby, and you would expect maybe 5 or 10 feet down to start finding interesting things. And what the local farmers have told us is that those berms have been very, very fruitful areas for artifact hunters, which is a very popular thing around here because of the amount of artifacts that are available. But and the berms are particularly rich in those things. But I think if we dig down 10 or 15 feet, or 5 or 10, I should say, then we'll start finding stuff.
Well, and I guess the skeptic would say, you may find stuff, but that doesn't mean it's the Book of Mormon.
No, that's true. What we'd like to do is find stuff that we could date. Now, when I said before that I didn't believe in carbon-14 dating...
Unless that helps your case, right?
Unless it helps my case. No, I don't believe in carbon-14 dating that goes back any more than a few thousand years. I think they try to calibrate it to account for errors, but I think the flood basically changed everything, and you can't measure the carbon-14 prior to the flood.
My understanding is carbon dating is very accurate. Well, within, you know, say 100 years or so. I mean, it has an error range up
but
to
even
30,000
that depends
years.
on if it's contaminated or there's a host of things that can go wrong with the sample. So I do think it's fairly accurate for short-range dates, but...
Would it be accurate for Book of Mormon times?
I think so. And in fact, when we did our magnetometry scans over the 250 acres, which was 2 years ago, we identified what looked like to be roundhouses and post holes and things. But and then we did some coring, and we took core samples from areas that looked very fruitful based on the scanning results, and we came up with charcoal, and that kind of stuff can be dated. And the magnetometry scans, it's designed to detect, you know, where there were fires. And so fire pits are the type of things that show up on there. And so we could get charcoal by putting coring it down to the level where the scan said it was. And this was very precise GPS coordinates that we used. And we sent those off to Finland, and there's a company over there that sent back the results. and they came out to be 1000 AD, which basically meant we're on the wrong trail, or we just didn't go deep enough. And the magnetometry scanning only goes about 5 feet, and that's what we took the samples from. So we think that the land's been built up over the years by farming and by time. You know, each I guess, I think I heard once that just normal dirt, you'll get an inch of stuff every 10 years or something, and so you can multiply it out, and you have several feet in 2,000 years. So
you're cool with carbon dating within the last 6,000 years?
I'm cool with it within that level.
Okay,
but even that needs to be validated. And tree ring dating, dendrochronology, I think it's called, is actually the most accurate thing. And they have, you know, documented tree rings back to farther than you think, several thousand years BC. And so you can actually use that as a dating method also if you can come up with a tree sample or even a fossilized one.
Well, my understanding is they use tree rings to kind of recalibrate carbon dating, but, you know, it's still...
But tree rings don't go back 10,000 or 30,000, so they can't do it for that. But they can validate it for shorter periods. So getting back to the point here is, we're off on a tangent. Getting back to the point is, we need to do some actual boots on the ground digging and do some real archaeological excavations at the berm site. Would be probably the most fruitful area. And so we need to seek more information on that and more validation. Even if we find a wealth of things that date to the right period, that doesn't prove that it's Zarahemla, but it proves that it was something has to do with these berms. And so if you're a believer in the Book of Mormon, you can put 2 and 2 together. If you're not, you can, I don't know what else you could think of that these massive berms would be made for. But anyway.
Well, I mean, the Indians, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of history we don't know about.
Right.
And they could have been just fighting with each other and created some berms. I don't know.
Right. Because that's what you like to do in your evening is go out with a bucket and start creating a huge berm 13 feet high because it's just fun.
Well, no, I mean...
You might do it if the Lamanites are coming next year and you know they're coming.
You know, it could be Comanches versus Apaches or something for all I know.
Well, the Native American tribes that we're familiar with did not do anything like that. So.
Okay. Are you planning, or is there any attempt to try to involve any of the local universities, University of Iowa, University of Illinois, to help you with these archaeological digs?
I think that's the route we would like to go, but we haven't pursued it yet. We're too busy with the museum.
Do you think that would add credibility to your, you know, especially if they said, hey, this berm dates to 200 BC or whatever? It'd
be great to utilize any any technology that we can. And we've done that with the magnetometry scans and the electrical resistivity scans. And if Wayne's going to do some ground penetrating radar, that's great too. We want to employ all the technology we can use. And realistically, to do an excavation, you know, we need a consultant who has experience in that to guide us. And so we have to worry about our museum first. We have to worry about getting the funding for that. But I think that
the Phoenician Museum you're talking about?
The Phoenician Museum, yeah. But that is in the long term. I mean, it's in our list of things to do.
Do you think Wayne is interested in that kind of a thing?
He's very interested in that, yes.
As far as getting a university to help him with his dig?
He hasn't done that, but I think it's more of I think he would if it was easier. But not everybody wants to do it because, you know, it's attaching their name to some kind of religious net, you know, or religious endeavor because we're Book of Mormon enthusiasts. And so, but, you know, there's a Putnam Museum up in Burlington, is it? Not Burlington, Davenport. Yeah. And we were up there and saw some of the artifacts they had. We put on a little demonstration at a meeting, and they were very kind to us. And there are, we've had local schools come out and look at our equipment because when we had the magnetometry equipment, which we leased, it's very expensive stuff, but we leased it from a company in Germany and had it shipped over. And the local high school was very interested in that. We showed them how it worked and everything. And it was cool. So we want to employ all the technology we can And, we don't turn away any helpful suggestions from professionals, and we'll be seeking those in the future as we explore the berms.
Very cool. Very cool. What else do we need to cover? Is there anything else?
You want to talk about translation?
Let's do that. I forgot about that. We kind of started there, but then we got off,
Well, the translation of the Book of Mormon is very important to me from a Book of Mormon analysis perspective as I do my geography models.
Because we've had a conversation. Maybe I should preface it just a little bit.
Go ahead.
On Monday night, there's a Book of Mormon meeting. Jim Lucas and Jonathan Neville were in there, and there's been a, to me, surprising debate. Did Joseph Smith use the seer stone? Did he use the Urim and Thummim? Jim and Jonathan are of the opinion that he used the Urim and Thummim. I'm of the opinion, does it really matter if he used the gift and power of God, whether it was a seer stone or whether it was the Urim and Thummim? Who cares? But you, on the other hand, say it matters a lot. Why does it matter so much?
It matters because it has to do with the credibility of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, are the ones who did the work. I mean, there were other scribes, but Oliver Cowdery did by far the vast majority of it, testified, and it's in Scripture, that they use the plates and they use the Urim and Thummim. And that's official. And that's what they bore testimony to.
So you privilege Oliver and Joseph over everybody else?
Especially David Whitmer and others who left the church and then issued contradictory statements and supported books like Mormonism Unveiled. And so it's a credibility issue on Joseph Smith.
I don't think David supported Mormonism Unveiled.
Absolutely. He was anti.
No, he was still he didn't get excommunicated until 1837, 1838.
Yeah, but as soon as
Mormonism Unveiled came out in 1834, if I remember.
Right. But he was echoing the same things that Mormonism Unveiled said about the seer stone and stuff.
Okay.
And but he didn't do that until after he left the church. And so and his story is self-contradictory. He has about 6 different tales that he tells. And basically, he was in the mode of, in my opinion, talking to the nearest newspaper to get some attention, and he came up with all kinds of stuff that doesn't even match itself later. He was very malleable to his audience. What do you want to hear? What would get you excited about Mormons, either positive or negative?
So you view David Whitmer as a real critic?
After he left the church, he was, yeah. Yeah, he was of the opinion.
He wasn't like a mobber critic.
No, but he thought that he was a little wiser and smarter, and that this young whippersnapper Joseph Smith should be deferring to him because he could run the church better. And when things didn't always go his way, he didn't like it. But he was an attention seeker, in my opinion, and he sought attention through various newspapers and accounts and interviews that he would give. But his stories don't line up, but they're not credible. So that's my opinion on it.
Okay. So David said that Joseph used the seer stone, and you're rejecting David as an unreliable witness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so...
now, modern historians won't do that. They'll say, you have to treat everybody equally because you can't make moral judgments on who's right and who's wrong.
I'm not sure I agree with that characterization.
That's what happens. I've read it, and I've heard a modern historian say that you can't make your own judgments.
See, wait a minute. I'm going to have to step out on my thing here because I know that, especially like Matt Harris, one of my favorites, he says you have to evaluate the sources. Some are going to be more reliable. Is this an antagonistic witness and that sort of a thing? So I don't know that I would agree with the way that you characterize that. Right,
but I'm speaking more of secular historians, and they do that with the founding fathers too. They want a revisionist history, and the way they get revisionist history is you find somebody else that said something else. Like maybe George Washington wasn't such a great guy as they said he was. According to this guy, he was stiffed in his bill by George Washington, so he wasn't a great guy. But who are you going to believe, George Washington or this other guy? Well, this other guy has a more unbiased view, or this other guy is just as credible. Why don't we listen to him too? And so those things are built up. So the revisionist historian approach is to build that up so they have a story to tell and a book to write, and they can make some money. And I can become popular.
See, some would argue that Jonathan Neville is the revisionist historian.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think Jonathan Neville's totally sincere. I don't think he does it for those kind of reasons at all.
But
it
getting
happens.
back to the question,
it happens. I'm not trying to paint a broad brush, but I'm saying it happens, and it happens a lot.
But if Joseph translated by the gift and power of God, whether he used a seer stone or whether he used a Urim and Thummim, why does that matter?
Credibility.
You think that
he
when we say he used the seer stone, that Joseph loses credibility?
Absolutely, because he didn't say he used that. He said he used the Urim and Thummim and the plates, and he translated. So if somebody else comes along and says he didn't do that, he did it this way, that's Joseph Smith is a liar, the critics say. And I don't think he was. I think he told the truth. And he was very explicit about it, and so was Oliver Cowdery. There's no question about their statements. They're very explicit. And about Gomorrah being where it was and how the translation happened using the Urim and Thummim and the plates. So the idea that they threw the plates in the corner along with the Urim and Thummim and said, we got this neat seer stone we found in a well, it just plays into the hands of the critics. They love that because it makes Joseph Smith untruthful, and they stick his head in a hat and say, it looks funny too. Ha, ha, ha. And I hate that. I don't think it's true, and I think it's an unfair characterization, and it goes against his own testimony and his own history.
What about Richard Bushman's approach? Because it's been a long time since I read Rough Stone Rolling, but my remembrance is that his characterization of what happened was Joseph used the Urim and Thummim for the last 116 pages. I believe Emma was his main scribe at that time. Of course, Martin Harris, I think Emma and Martin were the main scribes. Martin Harris, of course, lost those. Joseph found the Urim and Thummim very difficult to use. I had a listener send me a replica of the Urim and Thummim, and I had to say, the lenses are wider than my head. Now, I guess he had a breastplate, so it was out in front of him a little bit. But I can understand why it would be very difficult to use. And so Richard Bushman's contention is, yes, he used the Urim and Thummim for the last 116 pages. It was hard to use. Joseph felt like he could get revelation from the seer stone, and so then he used the seer stone for what we have.
That's a lot of...
to me, that's uses both. And so what's wrong with that?
I would call it intellectual double clutching.
Intellectual what?
Double clutching.
Double clutching.
Yes. And so a lot of the impetus behind the seer stone narrative is the work that Royal Scouts has done in the Book of Mormon, where he says the evidence shows that Joseph Smith read word for word and Oliver Cowdery copied those words word for word. And so it seems to many people that you need the seer stone to do that, and the seer stone supports that narrative better. But I have a different perspective on the translation process than I think anybody else does. It's certainly different than Jonathan Neville does. I was telling you about my Tite. Should I tell you about Tite?
We were talking about that off camera, but we need that on camera as well.
Okay, Tite.
T-I-T-E, right?
T-I-T-E. That's an acronym that represents what I believe is a correct explanation for Joseph Smith's translation.
But you also believe in T-I-H-T, Tite, as well.
Yes, I do. I believe in both. It was a Tite translation. I believe the Book of Mormon text was sacrosanct. It's absolutely, as it came from the lips of Joseph Smith, it was like coming from the lips of God. God put the input into the Urim and Thummim, and Joseph Smith simply read it off. But let me explain Tite, how Tite works.
T-I-T-E, Tite.
T-I-T-T, yeah. Because I don't want to contradict what Section 9 says about the necessary effort that was required to do the
study it out in your mind.
Study it out in your mind and get inspiration about what it is and from the Holy Ghost. And so let's talk about the T. First T is translation. Joseph Smith had about 6 months of time before he started the translation where he had already obtained the plates and the Urim and Thummim. Well, what did he do in that time? We now have a little bit of a clue that he did some transcription and some studying but we don't know exactly. But we also have some quotes that there were angelic messengers that helped him understand what was on the plates. He had the Urim and Thummim, which wasn't hard to use. You just had to look in there and find out what you wanted, ask your question, basically. And so with that assistance of heavenly messengers and the assistance of the Urim and Thummim and the time frame of 6 months, Joseph Smith was able to teach himself what the Book of Mormon actually was saying in the original language. Now keep in mind that this is an Egyptian, Reformed Egyptian language, which means it's something like Demotic or Hieratic Egyptian, which is a language that's based on, it's called a logographic approach of writing, which means that each symbol had represent a word, essentially, at least one word, maybe more. And so when you look at the symbol like you do in Egyptian, you say, okay, this means this. And then you go on to the next. And then you put things together and you got a thought. And so Joseph Smith, and because it's logographic, it's not, you don't pronounce it. So, for example, the number 4 is logographic. It may be quattro or quatra or whatever the language you want to, you might say it in different ways in different languages, but it's 4. Okay? The meaning is clear in all languages, but you don't have to translate it to a language because you know the meaning because you have it right there. And so the same thing with the Book of Mormon. It was written in a logographic language like Egyptian, and he could learn what the symbols meant. He didn't have to pronounce Nephite, He didn't have to, even though that's possible, to spell it out. But so that's the T. He taught himself how to translate. He taught himself how to read it because he had divine help and he was a smart man. So the next letter of the TITE acronym is interpretation. And this is what a lot of people leave out. And of course, any translator, any modern translator of the Book of Mormon knows this is true. You may read it and understand it, but now to translate into a language, it's hard. It's an interpretation step. And so it requires some real effort and some time. Even with modern translations of the Book of Mormon, it takes a lot of time to translate it from one language from English to another language because you have to make the translation not only of the meaning, but how would they say it? In Joseph Smith's case, he had to translate it into biblical English that sounded scriptural. And so he couldn't do that on his own. He didn't have the training and the background for that in his early days, especially. He was not a learned man. Nobody thinks he was a learned man.
Except William Davis.
William Davis, does he? In his early days when he was 20?
Well, and Jonathan Neville actually kind of agrees, to be honest. He thinks Joseph did a lot more reading than we give him credit. Not that he had a formal education. William Davis has pointed out that Joseph received training as a Methodist exhorter. And so, that's not like college, but a kind of a vocational type of training. William Davis has a book called Vision of the Seer Stone. He talks about DNC9 quite a bit. Mm-hmm. William, his thesis is the Book of Mormon shows evidence of oral composition, but both William and Jonathan would agree that Joseph was probably much more well-read than people give him credit. I know Jonathan.
Well, that's news for me because I know Jonathan Neville's perspective on it, but I didn't know there was anybody else in the world that agreed with him.
Yeah.
Because most of the mainstream.
Well, I don't know that William and Jonathan agree with their conclusions, but they do agree that Joseph had a little bit more education.
Most people, though, and Emma Smith has been quoted as indicating that Joseph did not have could not write a well-worded letter.
Yeah, we talked about
much
that.
less the Book of Mormon, and so that was her testimony that it came from God. Because I know my husband, and he this didn't come from him.
Both Jonathan and William say that that's like an exaggeration.
Well. Maybe Emma would disagree if she was here.
Yeah.
But a lot of people said that Joseph Smith was not a well-educated man.
They say it's more like, Jay can't walk and chew gum at the same time.
Maybe so. But if you read Joseph Smith's history, too, he talks about their hard-scrabble life and how they had to work continually, and they were busy working, 10 hours a day and relished any time that they had, and they spent as a family. And I don't think he was running down to the nearest Palmyra bookstore to purchase the Jonathan Edwards book that he couldn't afford.
No, he could. He would just stand there and read them, supposedly.
Yeah, and so I just don't buy that, okay? So anyway, getting back to TITE. So I do believe he learned how to translate through effort and through inspiration and help, divine help, in that short time. And I believe that the interpretation step involved the Urim and Thummim, and that was the main purpose for the Urim and Thummim. And the Lord required him to understand the writing so that it was an actual translation. Lord could have done all the work himself and just hand over a printed, bound copy of the Book of Mormon, but he works through us, and that's how he does it. But he provided the Urim and Thummim as a huge aid for that. So once Joseph Smith understood what he was reading and what the concept was and what was going on that Mormon wrote in the abridgment, then he turned to the Urim and Thummim and got the word-for-word English translation, interpretation, I would call it, that we ended up having in the Book of Mormon, the biblical English. And Royal Skousen's documented this carefully. He knows that there were no strikeouts. There were no, that's not quite right, let's do it again, which even a learned man would have to do, Mm-hmm. They just got it right the first time. He just read it off, and then Oliver Cowdery wrote it down, and there was no, should we phrase this differently? Let's cross that out. I mean, if there are any cross-outs, it's because of a scribal error, not because of something that Joseph said. And there's a few minor cross-outs like that.
Mm-hmm.
But so then what I'm saying here is the Urim and Thummim provide the interpretation. So that is a conduit to heaven. So that interpretation would have come from God. Okay, so that makes the Book of Mormon the most correct book of any book because of its source and how it was translated and how it was interpreted. So then you come to the other T, which is transcription. So here's where you have a chance for error because it has to be transcribed, and Oliver Cowdery's got a quill pen that's got sometimes ink blots or maybe not enough ink, and he's a fairly intelligent man and school teacher, but still he doesn't know everything and he makes mistakes as he writes. And so
you're talking about the printer's manuscript? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about the transcription process itself, the initial transcription process. So the original manuscript was written down by Oliver Cowdery as dictated, literally dictated by Joseph Smith one time and one time only.
Is this a second copy you're talking about when you say transcription, or are you talking about the first
I'm talking about the first copy.
Okay.
But it also encapsulates the second copy when you talk about the E part of the tite, which is emendation. So sometimes Oliver Cowdery would make a mistake when he's writing, maybe a misspelling, or maybe he just didn't have his hand positioned right, so he might cross it out and do it again, And so there are emendations in the original, but especially in the printer's copy because they didn't want to let the original go since it was precious, so they made a printer's copy. But that introduced a few errors too, inevitably. And then, of course, it had to make it to the printer, who did a good job with it, but then he made a few errors too.
E.B. Grandin,
yeah. And so by the time you get done, you have some emendations. And then in the final product, Joseph Smith looked at it and said, golly gee, it did pretty good, but there are a few things we could fix here. And so he made some emendations as well. And there were some changes that Joseph Smith made that were a result of essentially clarifications that were not in the original Mormon Moroni version. For example, there is the case of where they refer to in the Book of Mormon as the waters of Mormon. And Joseph Smith said, or the waters of baptism. Of course, in the Hebrew tradition, there's a mikvah, which is basically a cleansing ritual, which you can call baptism. Mm-hmm. But he added that for clarification.
He added mikvah?
No, he added or waters of baptism.
Oh.
And so you could say that maybe Moroni or Mormon should have been more clear about that. Well, Joseph Smith helped him. That's an emendation. But the ancient Book of Mormon authors didn't claim perfection either. They just said there's going to be imperfections in this, and you might need to fix a thing or two, but it still comes from God despite our imperfections. And so you have an emendation process. And of course, since then, there's been many, many versions trying to fix mistakes and clarify things over the years. And we have many versions of the Book of Mormon that have sprouted out from different sources. But I go back, and what I've used always in my Book of Mormon geography work is Royal Skousen's book, The Book of Mormon, the earliest text. I believe it is the most accurate to what came from the lips of Joseph Smith. And he's a linguist, and he knows what he's doing. He's a technical guy, so I relate to him. And some say he may not be that pleasant, but he's never been unpleasant to me. I've never even met him, but I respect his work. And so
his attention to detail, minute detail, is incredible.
it is.
I don't know how he does that.
I can only say positive things about the work he's done, and it's a huge contribution to the understanding of the Book of Mormon. And it's been critical in what I've done, because using his copy, his version of the Book of Mormon, I've been able to see things that are in there that are not in the regular one, that clarify some of the geography things. Not much, but it's been a benefit. Mm-hmm. And even reading it on a personal basis, I find that the sense lines that he uses and the way he lays it out makes it much more readable than double column paragraphs and all that, and hyphens, which aren't necessary.
Yeah, I think the paragraph form is it's a lot easier. It gives you a different
It's easier on the brain.
Experience.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of that version of the Book of Mormon, and when I read it now, I read that version. I don't find an occasional extra "it came to pass" a problem. And even some of the awkward language, which is perfectly fine in Old English, but didn't fit Palmares, mm-hmm. is fine. It doesn't bother me. I mean, it may sound a little silly if you look at it based on our grammar that we use today, but for Old English, it didn't. So I think that basically God provided the interpretation of Joseph Smith's translation, and he picked biblical English to do it. Mm-hmm. And that's basically Royal Scouts' perspective on it too, and I'm totally on board with that.
Interesting.
Tight. So, and here's another perspective too. The Joseph Smith didn't have the Urim and Thummim when it came to the Doctrine and Covenants or the Pearl of Great Price. He didn't use it. And somebody asked him once, "How come you don't use the Urim and Thummim anymore?" He said, "Because I don't need it anymore." And why didn't he need it? Because when he first started, he didn't have his brain full of scriptural phraseology. But by the time he came to the end of the Book of Mormon, he was saying, "I knew that's what it was going to say." Because I've read this symbol before, and I know what it means, and I know how the Lord translates it, and he probably knew exactly what it is. And so when we get the biblical language in the Pearl of Great Price and in the Doctrine and Covenants, I think it's because of the training Joseph Smith got when he translated the Book of Mormon that carried forth to these other scriptures. And so at that point, yeah, he was using his own words, but he was very practiced at it by then. So he knew how to interpret it in a way that sounded scriptural, mm-hmm. even though he received the revelation as thoughts, probably not the exact words. So that's another perspective of how I explain that Joseph Smith didn't use the Urim and Thummim for everything. Because the Urim and Thummim was returned to the angel. So, I mean, it was out of his purview.
Yeah.
So.
Well, cool. Is there anything else? What are we missing?
I don't know. I thought you'd do more talking.
We've been almost 2 hours.
Is that right? Holy cow. Let me just say this. If you're serious about the Book of Mormon, you have to look at the Zarahemla-centric Heartland model, because it's the most complete. It's arguable. You can argue with anybody that it's the most accurate, but while it's unarguable, it is the most complete. It has cities, valleys, lands. It has missionary journeys, battle diagrams. It has all the GPS information. It has the table where everything is laid out that you can compare to.
Your internal table you're talking about.
Yeah, right.
Internal references. What you need to add, the geology. I'm gonna point that out.
Well, maybe you and I get together and you can show me how, but I'm not sure. I'm not seeing the fit.
One of the nice things about Jerry, I bought his book. I think it was like $80 on Amazon because it's out of print. But he told me it's free on the internet, so I'll show you where that is. I don't remember the website. I'll find it, but
yeah. So a formal
SLR, I want to say
a formal methodology, computer-aided assistance, data analytics, and including everything in the Book of Mormon. Add that to Google topography, and you've got enough tools there to reconstruct the Book of Mormon, and it's been done. And I would love people to say it's not accurate. You need to improve this or that. I'm totally open to that. But all I claim is that it's the most complete. And so other models that have 10% of the cities in it are just not complete. That's fine. You have 10%, but that's
I know that
doesn't cut the mustard.
That's been a big criticism of most Heartland models. I wasn't aware that you had one. I was familiar with Rod's. I was familiar with Jonathan's. I didn't realize Rod and Ryan were different.
Well, I think Rod has is part of the emphasis. I mean, part of the input behind Ryan's. I think Ryan does the actual work of producing the maps.
Okay.
But I haven't seen anything separately from Rod. But I think they're kind of in agreement and they kind of do it together. But I just assume that. But I know basically Rod's a ardent Heartlander. So. Yeah.
But I agree the detail is lacking. So it'll be interesting. I know Jerry, one of his big issues was there wasn't enough detail on these maps. And so I'm pretty sure he's not aware of your map. And so
I'll engage with anybody on anything.
He's moving on to other things.
What I would also recommend is that someone who goes into and looks at my website, Heartland, the holyscriptures.info, go to the Q&A section, because all of the major objections that everybody struggles with Book of Mormon geography is answered in the Q&A. It's just right there. And so it's easy to see the comparison to other models. It's easy to understand why the Sidon River flows south and not north. It's easy to say why I put Manti north and not south. It's easy to explain Alma 17.1, which people trip up on. Everything is there. I don't think there's very few questions you could have that isn't answered in the Q&A section that I haven't dealt with already. There's a lot of technical details if someone wants to spend half their life on it can get into, and I'm sure there's some errors like Oliver Cowdery made, but in the main...
I just remembered one more question.
In the main, I'm confident of it.
Are you familiar with Brian Stubbs?
Brian
Stubbs?
Stubbs. No.
So Brian has worked with Jerry a little bit. Brian's a linguist. One of his, and I know Brant Gardner disagrees with Brian, but one of his things is he looks at Uto, like Ute Indian, Uto, Aztecan language, and he says that is the closest to Hebrew that he's been able to find. Now, the Utes and the Aztecs are southwestern United States, kind of a little bit of a distance, both from Meso and from Heartland. I know Brant kind of dismisses it and says, well, it's not in the right area, right time. And so I'm curious if you've, it sounds like you haven't heard of them.
No.
But do you have a response where it's kind of close to Baja? That's another theory of the Book of Mormon. But do you have any response to that?
My response was if I put it through my Book of Mormon scoring algorithm, I suspect it would give out to about 25%.
No, he's not. He's not a geographer, not at all.
Okay.
He's only talking about the language of the Utes and the Aztecs, and he says their language has some parallels with Hebrew, and so
I don't doubt that. The Decalogue stone was found in the Southwest, and it has the same language that you find on the Michigan relics, and it's the Ten Commandments are on the Decalogue stone, and so that comes from that area. The Book of Mormon says that the people spread out throughout the entire land, and so it's certainly not. They certainly weren't limited to the limited geography that I present. That geography only represents primarily the time from the 100 BC to the time of Christ coming to visit, which is a little narrow slice, and that's where the Book of Mormon gives us our big dose of geography, is in that slice. But yet, things happened the other 900 years that are significant, and so I don't doubt that. I've heard the Algonquin language of the Great Lakes and New York has a lot of similarities too, so it doesn't surprise
I don't
me.
know if Brian's done any work on that, but perhaps.
Yeah. And of course, speaking language, spoken language and written language are two separate things. But
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of Native American languages have been lost or not documented, so it's hard to compare. And also things would change a lot after 2,000 years. In fact, when the Nephites found the Mulekites, they said that we couldn't understand them.
Right. Brian talks about how much, I mean, even if you go back, if you look at English, if you go back to 1000 AD, you read something like Beowulf, and it's like that.
Holy cow.
That's hardly English. What is that?
Yeah, and then when it's written, you can almost make it out, but you can't really. If it was spoken, it'd be total gibberish.
Yeah. So Brian talks about the changes in languages because, supposedly 600 BC, 400 AD, that's 1,000 years. And so it should have changed. And so he talks about that in his book. So.
Right. Oh, one more thing I'd mention is with our Phoenician ship, there is a tie to the Phoenician culture in the language in the Book of Mormon. For example, the port city of Sidon matches the river Sidon.
Right.
And so Zarahemla, Brian Ellis, is identified as being a Phoenician word as well. And so you would expect a Phoenician word to be, if the Phoenicians facilitated Mulek coming over, which makes a lot of sense, there's a tie-in linguistically to that supports it.
Very good.
So,
well,
it's been good.
Yeah. I don't want to wear out my welcome. I think I've asked you all my questions. So, any last things you want to share before I let you go?
Yeah, heartland.theholyscriptures.info. Send me your questions. I'll engage with anyone. I look forward to input and help, actually, because what I've done is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get into it just to see if your model matches mine. If you don't have a year of your life to devote to it, maybe you shouldn't, because it's that complicated. But it's worth it for those who really care about the Book of Mormon and really care where things really happened.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to score your map against the entity relationship table that I was talking about, there's an example of how that's scored on the website, and you can do that too and see how your map matches up to my database.
I'd be curious if people have issues with your entity relationship table and say, you've got that wrong.
Well, I'm sure there are some things wrong on it, I'm sure. But what it does, though, is it presents for each location in the Book of Mormon a list of things, characteristics. It's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. It has a certain orientation, a certain color, a certain shape on the knob. And so each location has that. And each relationship that I document in this special nomenclature, this machine readable, has multiple scriptures that back it up. So if all the scriptures are wrong, then tell me why they're wrong. If there's just one scripture and I'm misinterpreting it, I'll change my model in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. And
you've got a lot of errors to fix, right?
Yeah. Well, if it might spit out some errors, then. Yeah. But a lot of the changes can be made and not destroy the whole model. Mm-hmm. So. But I want it to be the most accurate as possible. I've been over the entity relationship table probably 5 times. Mm-hmm. It has to be polished and gone over and over and over.
Right.
And I have to read the Book of Mormon again and say, oh, I didn't see that last time. Oh, I wonder what this does. Mm-hmm. So I'll plug it into the algorithm and say, oh, thank heavens, it didn't ruin my whole thing. But sometimes it does ruin some things, and I have error messages, and I have to go back and say, well, I'm wrong here somewhere. I hope this could be reconciled. One case was, I found in the Book of Mormon that the land of Nephi was mentioned in conjunction with the land of Bountiful. I go, holy cow, you're kidding me. That can't be. I mean, that blows my whole model to pieces because the land of Nephi is nowhere near the land of Bountiful. But then, thanks to Royal Skousen, who saved me, it turned out that there was an ink blot or something on Oliver's pen, and the correct rendition is the land of the Nephites. Oh. And the land of Bountiful was the land of the Nephites. In fact, it was their most strategic military location. It was more important than even Zarahemla. When it came right down to it, that's the last thing they wanted to fall. And so I was saved. But it shows that those things can happen, and there are mistakes. I'm not perfect. I just have a better and a more complete and a more structured methodology than others have used.
Mm-hmm. Well, cool. Well, Jay Mackley, thank you so much for your hospitality and especially for being here on Gospel Tangents. I really appreciate it.
You're certainly welcome.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jay Mackley, a limited geography Heartlander. Jay, thanks you so much for your hospitality, letting me stay at your house, and giving me a tour of the Phoenician Museum. I also want to add that this weekend, July 14th and 15th, is the grand reopening of the Phoenician Museum there in Montrose, Iowa. So you'll have to check it out. It's going to be a lot of fun. I would go, but I've got some family commitments, so it's bad timing for me. But if you're in the Iowa area, Nauvoo area, check it out. It'll be a lot of fun. In our next conversation, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Janice Johnson. We're going to talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and she had something very interesting to say regarding the John D. Lee trial.
When John D. Lee finally comes to trial in 1875, his first trial is like the OJ trial in the mid-90s.
It's that big?
It is that big. It is newspapers across the country and into Europe, onto the continent and the UK. You have reports on this trial, small towns, large cities. It is the thing of the day.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, you can hear the audio only at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview with no interruptions. If you want to watch the entire video for just $8 a month, you can also sign up at Patreon or on youtube.com/gospeltangents and just subscribe here. You can watch the entire video uncut before everybody else. Also, if you'd like to continue to support Gospel Tangents, you can either sign up for our $10 or $20 memberships, or you can get some cool gear like this hat. I've got the coffee mugs like this here. We've got sweatshirts and t-shirts, and I'm even thinking about ties. Somebody said they wanted a tie, so I'll see if I can get that on my store. So go to gospeltangents.com store, and you can get some Gospel Tangents gear. So you don't want to miss that. So anyway, thanks for listening. If you'd like to check out some of our other videos, check out here.